Appearance of the handbag in all three societies can be considered evidence of the natural mixing of ancient Middle Eastern civilization.
For more than a century, archaeologists and historians have been staring at one of the strangest objects ever carved into ancient stone. It looks incredibly familiar. A small rectangular body, a rigid handle rising over the top, and in the hand of an ancient supernatural figure, it looks almost exactly like something a modern person might carry through an airport. A handbag. But why would an ancient god be carrying a handbag? What was inside it? And more importantly, why does a remarkably similar shape appear in ancient artwork separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles? The mystery becomes even stranger when you realize that one version appears in Assyria, another appears at Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, and another has been identified by some observers in ancient Mesoamerican art. At first glance, it looks like evidence of something impossible, a forgotten civilization, an ancient global network, or, as some theories suggest, visitors from somewhere beyond Earth. But there's a problem with all of those explanations. The answer may have been sitting in plain sight the entire time. And to find it, we have to begin inside one of the greatest palaces of the ancient world. Nearly 3,000 years ago, the city of Nimrud stood on the banks of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. It was one of the great centers of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. At its heart stood a massive palace built under King Ashurnasirpal II, a ruler known not only for warfare, but for monumental construction. The palace was designed to overwhelm anyone who entered. Huge stone slabs covered the walls. They showed soldiers, kings, battles, hunting scenes, sacred symbols, and mysterious winged beings. These weren't ordinary people. Some had human faces. Others had the heads of birds. They possessed enormous wings and stood beside sacred imagery, appearing again and again throughout the palace. They were associated with the Apkallu, legendary supernatural sages connected with wisdom, protection, and civilization. And almost every time you see one of these figures, something strange appears in one of its hands. A container. It has a squared body, a curved handle, and from a distance it looks almost exactly like a handbag. This is the image that launched countless internet theories. Because once you see it, your modern brain immediately recognizes the shape. But there's a crucial mistake people make. They look only at the object. They don't look at what the figure is doing. In the other hand, the winged being holds a small, cone-shaped object. And it isn't simply holding it. The figure is extending it toward a sacred tree or toward another important figure. That gesture changes the entire scene. Because the Assyrians weren't carving random objects. Their palace reliefs were carefully designed religious and political messages. The winged figures weren't tourists carrying luggage. They were performing a ritual. And when archaeologists began comparing the artwork with surviving Mesopotamian texts, the mysterious handbag started looking much less mysterious. The container was associated with purification. The smaller object was used to sprinkle or apply a substance. The figure could therefore be understood as carrying a vessel containing a consecrated liquid while using the other implement to distribute it. In other words, the famous handbag may actually have been a ritual bucket, not advanced technology, not alien equipment, not a mysterious device from a lost civilization. A container. But that doesn't completely solve the mystery. Because if the Assyrian object was simply a ritual container, why does a remarkably similar shape appear somewhere much older? To answer that, we have to travel thousands of years backward. Around 11,000 years ago, long before the pyramids, long before the great cities of Mesopotamia, and long before writing, people were building something extraordinary in southeastern Turkey. Göbekli Tepe. The site changed archaeology forever. Its builders lived in a world very different from the one we normally associate with monumental architecture. There were no giant empires, no kings ruling vast territories, no writing system explaining their beliefs. And yet these people were able to quarry and move enormous stones and arrange them into monumental structures. Many of the pillars were carved with animals. Snakes, scorpions, birds, vultures, foxes. Other creatures whose exact meanings remain debated. The carvings are so detailed that some appear almost alive. But one particular pillar became famous for another reason. Among the collection of symbols are several shapes that, to modern eyes, look remarkably like the Assyrian handbag. A body, a curved form above it, a familiar silhouette. And suddenly the mystery jumps across 7,000 years. The Assyrian version is thousands of years younger. The Gobekli Tepe carving predates the Assyrian Empire by an enormous amount. There was no Assyria when these stones were carved. There was no Sumerian civilization as we know it. The pyramids had not yet been built. Writing had not yet transformed human civilization. So how could two ancient cultures create such similar imagery? This is where the most spectacular theories begin. Some people argue that the shape represents knowledge inherited from a forgotten civilization. Others believe it could be evidence of contact between cultures separated by immense distances. And some take the theory even further, suggesting that ancient humans were depicting beings who came from the sky. But there's an important question that gets lost beneath all the excitement. Does a similar shape automatically mean a shared origin? Not necessarily. Humans are remarkably good at independently inventing similar solutions to similar problems. Imagine you need to carry water. You need something that can hold liquid. You need to lift it. You need to transport it without spilling everything. A container with a stable body and a handle is an extremely practical solution. Different cultures don't need to meet before discovering that design. The problem itself pushes them towards similar answers. That is why similar technologies appear independently throughout human history. Pottery takes similar forms. Tools converge on practical designs. Baskets develop comparable structures. Weapons can evolve along similar lines. The reason isn't necessarily communication. Sometimes it's simply physics. And sometimes the simplest explanation is also the most powerful. But then another ancient civilization enters the story. Thousands of miles from Assyria, across an ocean, in what is now Mexico. The Olmec civilization created enormous monuments, ceremonial centers, colossal stone heads, jade objects, and a complex symbolic tradition. Among their most famous works is Monument 19. The carving depicts a human figure beneath or within the body of a giant serpent. The serpent arches around the figure in a dramatic composition, and in the figure's hand is another strange object. A compact body, a curved element above it. Once again, the silhouette resembles the famous Assyrian container. Now the mystery appears almost impossible. Turkey, Iraq, Mexico, different civilizations, different environments, different religious traditions, thousands of miles apart, and, in some cases, thousands of years apart. Could all three really be showing the same object? This is where we need to slow down, because archaeology does not work by asking which explanation sounds most exciting. It asks what the evidence can actually support. For the Assyrian reliefs, the evidence is unusually strong. We have the artwork. We have repeated examples. We have the ritual context. And we have written traditions that help explain purification ceremonies. The container fits into a recognizable religious practice. That part of the mystery can be narrowed dramatically. But Göbekli Tepe is different. Its builders did not leave behind written explanations. We don't possess a dictionary telling us what every animal and symbol meant. We don't know exactly what the strange shapes represented. They could have been containers. They could have represented objects that no longer exist. They could have been symbols rather than literal depictions. And they could have had a meaning completely unrelated to the later Assyrian ritual tradition. That uncertainty is important, because it would be wrong to take the Assyrian explanation and simply paste it backward 7,000 years. The shape may be similar. The meaning has not been proven to be. The same problem becomes even stronger when we reach the Olmec example. There is no established archaeological chain connecting the Olmec world with ancient Assyria. No proven trade route. No shared writing system. No unmistakable Assyrian artifact discovered in an Olmec ceremonial center. No documented voyage carrying Mesopotamian religious symbols across the Atlantic. The resemblance is interesting, But resemblance alone is not proof of contact. If a lost global civilization had really carried one sacred symbol around the planet, we would expect more than one mysterious shape. We would expect fingerprints, a shared alphabet, similar measurements, common architectural techniques, matching religious terminology, identical technologies, trade goods, or genetic evidence. Civilizations that interact usually leave behind more than a single silhouette. And this is where the global handbag theory begins to weaken, because the supposed connection is almost entirely visual. The cultures themselves remain dramatically different. Their languages developed separately. Their calendars were different. Their architecture evolved differently. Their religions were different. Their technologies followed different paths. Their artistic traditions were distinct. The handbag may be similar. The civilizations are not. And perhaps that is the biggest clue of all. Maybe there was never one handbag. Maybe there was never one universal symbol. Maybe different people simply created similar shapes, because humans everywhere face similar problems. A container with a handle is one of the most natural objects a human being can invent. And once that shape becomes useful, it can also become sacred. That is exactly what seems to have happened in Assyria. The container was no longer merely something for carrying liquid. It became part of ritual. The liquid could represent purification. The act of sprinkling could represent protection. The supernatural figure carrying the vessel became part of a larger religious message. The object was ordinary. Its context made it extraordinary. And that may explain why modern viewers have misunderstood it for so long. We removed the object from its context and gave it a modern name. Handbag. The ancient artist would never have called it that. And once we use that word, our imagination does the rest. We imagine someone carrying personal belongings. We imagine travel. We imagine technology. We imagine an ancient visitor arriving with luggage from somewhere else. But the Assyrian relief isn't showing a traveler. It is showing a ritual. And the object in the other hand tells us that. This is the detail that changes everything. The answer wasn't hidden inside the container. It was hidden in the gesture beside it. The Assyrians left us enough evidence to reconstruct the scene. The winged figure carries a vessel. The other hand holds a ritual implement. The sacred tree stands before the figure. The action is connected with purification and protection. The palace itself was designed to surround the king with supernatural guardians. The entire scene was a message. And once you understand that, the handbag of the gods becomes something far more interesting than an ancient alien artifact. It becomes a snapshot of how an ancient civilization understood power, purity, religion, and protection. But Göbekli Tepe still refuses to give us a simple answer. Those strange shapes remain. The people who carved them are gone. Their language is gone. Their explanations are gone. What survived is stone. And stone can preserve a shape for 11,000 years while completely losing the meaning behind it. That is the real mystery. Not that ancient people somehow possessed object from another world, but that we can stand in front of something created 11,000 years ago and still have no idea what its makers were trying to tell us. Maybe those shapes really were containers. Maybe they were symbolic objects. Maybe they represented something completely different. And perhaps one day, another excavation will reveal the missing piece. A buried artifact, a related carving, a new structure, something that finally tells us what the builders of Göbekli Tepe believed. Until then, we have to resist the temptation to turn uncertainty into certainty. The evidence does not prove an ancient global civilization. It does not prove extraterrestrial visitors. And it does not prove that the Göbekli Tepe symbols in Assyrian containers shared the same meaning. What it does prove is more fascinating. Ancient humans were capable of creating complex symbols and monumental architecture thousands of years earlier than scholars once expected. Assyrian artists created sophisticated religious imagery whose meaning can still be reconstructed from surviving texts and rituals. And humans separated by enormous distances can independently create surprisingly similar objects. The mysterious handbag is therefore not really a story about aliens. It's a story about interpretation. It's about how easily a familiar shape can trick us into believing we understand something ancient. It's about how one missing piece of context can transform an ordinary ritual object into an impossible mystery. And it's also a reminder that sometimes archaeology doesn't end with an answer. Sometimes it ends with a better question. The Assyrian container has an explanation. The Gobekli Tepe shapes do not. The Olmec resemblance remains intriguing but unproven. And that is where the mystery should remain. Not exaggerated, not dismissed, just waiting for evidence. Because perhaps the most fascinating thing about the ancient world is not how much we know. It's how much has disappeared. Empires vanished. Languages died. Temples collapsed. Religious traditions changed. And meanings that were once obvious to everyone eventually became completely invisible. The people who carved those stones knew what they meant. We don't. That gap of thousands of years is the real mystery. So the next time you see the famous ancient figure holding what looks like a handbag, don't just stare at the object. Look at the other hand. Look at the sacred tree. Look at the ritual. Look at the surrounding symbols. And most importantly, look at the evidence. Because the truth may not be as spectacular as an alien handbag. It may be something much more human. A container. A ritual. A symbol. And a civilization sophisticated enough to leave its beliefs carved in stone for thousands of years. The gods may never have carried luggage from another world. They may simply have carried a vessel from their own. And somewhere in the hills of Turkey, an even older civilization left behind a shape that still refuses to tell us what it meant. Maybe one day we'll finally understand it. Or maybe the stone will keep its secret forever. Either way, the mystery was never really about a handbag. It was about how much of the human story has been lost, and how much may still be waiting beneath the ground.